Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I wish you a very happy birthday and many returns of the day. So, to ask the Secretary of State what steps the government is taking to support sub-postmasters wrongly convicted in the Post Office Horizon scandal.
I now call the Minister with 3 minutes to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday. I've listened to a number of postmasters' stories personally, and indeed seen the recent Panorama programme, and it's impossible to ignore the negative impact that the Horizon dispute and court case has had on affected postmasters' lives, their livelihoods, their financial situation, their reputations, and for some also, as we know, their physical and mental health. Convicted claimants seeking to have their conviction overturned are going through a further process with the Criminal Case Review Commission, who have the power to refer cases to the Court of Appeal to consider whether any convictions are unsafe. As you'll appreciate, it's important that the government does not seek to influence this process or comment on any individual cases there. I can confirm, though, that the Post Office is cooperating with the CCRC to the fullest extent, and the government is monitoring this. 47 out of the 61 CCRC cases have now been referred to the Court of Appeal, and it's for the courts to decide whether the convictions are unsafe. But let me also acknowledge the strength of feeling on all sides of the House on this matter, which has been evident in the debates I've participated in earlier this year and correspondence that I've had from many, many members. And that's why government is committed to establishing an independent review to consider whether the Post Office has learnt the necessary lessons from the Horizon dispute and court case, and to provide an independent and external assessment of its work to rebuild its relationship with its postmasters. Full details of the terms of reference for that independent review are set out in a written ministerial statement that I laid in the House this morning. We're keen to see this review launch as soon as possible, and we're in the process of identifying a chair to lead the work of the review.
Thank you. Chiamora.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the Post Office Horizon scandal may well be the largest miscarriage of justice in our history. 900 prosecutions, each one its own story of dreams crushed, careers ruined, families destroyed, reputation smashed and lives lost. Innocent people bankrupted and imprisoned. Does the Minister agree that Monday's Panorama programme adds to the sense of a cover-up on a grand scale in the Post Office, a trusted national institution, and all because of the failings in the Post Office Horizon system? For over a decade, the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance campaigned to get at the truth, but the Post Office denied all wrongdoings, imposing huge lawyers' fees on the claimants. Justice Fraser's High Court ruling in December paved the way finally for justice for some, but the mediated settlement means the truth remains hidden. Will the Minister agree there can be no justice without truth? So many questions remain unanswered. When did the Post Office know the Horizon system could cause money to disappear? And what responsibility did the developer Fujitsu have? What did ministers, to whom the Post Office is accountable, do, and what did they know? Who was responsible for innocent people going to jail? Have they been held accountable, and will all victims be properly compensated? 3 months ago, the Prime Minister committed to a public inquiry, but we now hear that this is to consider whether the Post Office has learned the necessary lessons. We need an inquiry not simply to learn lessons, but to get to the truth. Only a judge-led inquiry can do that, with the Post Office compelled to cooperate. Will the Minister now agree to the judge-led inquiry we need? It is the very least the victims deserve. We need answers, not more delay. We will not rest until we get this, and justice for all those wronged in this scandal.
Minister Scully.
Thank you, and I welcome the lady to her place, and I appreciate her comments there. A public inquiry, according to Jason Beer QC, one of the leading experts on this, talks about what happened, why did it happen, and who is to blame, and what can be done to prevent it from happening again. This independent review, chaired by someone independent from both the government and the Post Office, will indeed look to do that, to understand and acknowledge what went wrong in relation to the Horizon system by drawing on the evidence of those people who, as we have discussed, have been wronged in this situation, using both Justice Fraser's judgment and words and his own evidence that he will call upon. Government wants to be fully assured, I want to be fully assured, that the right lessons are learned for the future and concrete changes have taken place at Post Office Limited to ensure that it doesn't be repeated. We want to be sure that through this review there's a public summary of the failings that occurred at Post Office Limited, drawing on the judgments and listening to those, as I say, have been most affected. This is the purpose of the independent review we're in the process of setting up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely right that we acknowledge the injustices that was done at the time. I remember having conversations, having spent a bit of time in post offices in my time with sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses, and they acknowledged to me that they couldn't get their books to balance at the end of particular days, and they were really worried about it at that time. But it's worth remembering that the post office network is made up of sub-postmasters, and they need our support at this moment in time. So what can the department do to ensure that our sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses that are working around the country have the ability to be able to continue while this Horizon scandal is taking place?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that question. Government provided nearly £2 billion for the period 2010 to 18 and is investing a further £370 million from April 2018 to 21 to invest in the transformation of the business. A negotiated agreement was secured with all 28 UK banks in 2019 and took effect in 2020. That's resulted in a significant increase to the overall fees received by the Post Office of the banks, which will rise further if transaction volumes continue to grow. We've also encouraged the Post Office to strengthen its relationship with postmasters and postmaster training to foster a stronger commercial partnership. We've recently put in place personalised support for postmasters. If we are going to get the future relationship with postmasters right, we've got to, yes, tackle these injustices that have happened in the past, but we've also got to rebuild, with the new management in the Post Office, trust and training and respect for the sub-postmasters of the future.
We now come to the SNP spokesperson, Patricia Gibson, with 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We can all agree with the Minister that the reputations, mental health and lives of the victims of this scandal have been ruined. Alan Bates, the former sub-postmaster who led the legal case against the Post Office, has been clear that the Post Office has not changed. Now, it's been 6 months since judges found major issues, including an excessive culture of secrecy, confidentiality, generally in the Post Office, but specifically relating around Horizon. So can the Minister explain why we still aren't getting a public inquiry into the scandal? The Prime Minister's told this House on the 26th of February that such an inquiry would be established, but the proposal set out by the Minister today falls short of that. And we welcome the BIS inquiry into this issue, but we really need a full independent public inquiry. And finally, does the Minister understand the anger and disappointment at the length of time it is taking to get the truth about one of the largest miscarriages of justice in the UK's history, amidst very serious allegations of perjury being levelled against Fujitsu's employees, the company behind the system? And will the Minister apologise to the hundreds of postmasters whose lives have been ruined, who've lost their homes, their livelihoods, their reputations as a result of inaction by this government?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable lady for that question. And the review that we've put in place, that we're putting in train, covers the areas that a public inquiry will achieve. We want to find out exactly what's going on. We don't want to duplicate the effort. We already have a number of words from Justice Fraser that point to exactly where the chairman of the independent review needs to look. In terms of the fact that this has happened, and this is a situation that's been going on for some 20-odd years, it is disgraceful that it's taken this time for Alan Bates and his fellow group litigants to actually get to a settlement, and that so many people have had to suffer as a result. What I'm keen to do now in the short tenure so far in this role is to push on and to make sure that they can get the answers that they need.
Mary Robinson.
It's clear that the Post Office concealed evidence that would have cleared sub-postmasters who were convicted and had their lives ruined. A major part of the evidence came from a Fujitsu whistleblower who revealed that Post Office accounts could be changed remotely from Fujitsu offices. Sub-postmasters now have the opportunity to sue the Post Office for malicious prosecution, but while those who were subject to criminal proceedings are able to make claims, people who brought civil claims which have been settled cannot. This was clearly not the intention of the court. So how can such a disparity in outcome be justified?
In terms of the whistleblower, I know that Justice Fraser recommended a number of individuals to the Criminal Prosecution Service, and that will follow its train accordingly. In terms of the group litigation, the settlement was agreed with the Post Office, and that included legal and all other costs. So in that circumstances, government can't accept any further requests for payments. But if postmasters who have been convicted have their convictions overturned, there is a process in place for them to receive compensation if appropriate.
Chair of the Select Committee, Durham Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will know that my committee is undertaking an inquiry on the Post Office Horizon scandal, and it's a matter of regret that we were unable to take oral evidence from Mr. Reid, the current CEO of the Post Office, Ms Venables, the former CEO, and Fujitsu as planned on the 24th of March because of the lockdown. The sub-postmasters who have suffered such a depth of injustice, such a wide range of harm, will no doubt be welcoming the news today of the Minister's inquiry. But can he confirm to the House that that inquiry will have sufficient power to compel the disclosure of documentary evidence and to compel witnesses to come before it to give evidence in public?
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman's question, and I look forward. I'm sorry I wasn't able to attend that session for the same reason, but I hope in the future to engage fully with the committee. And I think this is the key thing for the Post Office. The Post Office has said, and I will make sure, the best of my ability, to make sure that they will disclose everything. As I say, I saw the same panorama programme as he did when there was a big discussion and a lot of peace about non-disclosure. This cannot happen again. We have to draw that line and make sure that we do get answers. The chairman of that independent review will push for that. I will push for that. And I've already said that they will comply appropriately.
On the Post Office to apologise to all those who they have wronged and to pay generous compensation to them in the circumstances. Will the Minister put the government's voice behind that and make that a demand of the Post Office?
The Post Office have acknowledged mistakes within the settlement, the case that we've had. In terms of the group litigation, as I said, both parties, I'm glad that both parties were able to reach a settlement. Other postmasters who have had maybe suffered a shortfall will be able to take advantage of the historic shortfall scheme that the Post Office has launched, so that they can come forward and that be investigated and hopefully those wrongs righted.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Myself and the member from North West Durham and Lord Arbuthnot have been campaigning for this for over 7 years. People's have been imprisoned. People's lives have been ruined, both financially and mentally. They are being treated, I've said on record before, in a way a totalitarian state would treat people. The fact of the matter is, Minister, only a judge-led inquiry will get to the bottom of what is needed. I've cross-examined many of his predecessors over the last 7 years. Please, can I urge him to actually insist on that? Because without that, we'll not get to the truth. And it is not just the Post Office to blame here, it's the government as well. Because government ministers who've got shareholder representation on that board have sat back and done absolute nothing, including last year allowing the Post Office to spend over £100 million of public money to try and bankrupt the Justice for Postmasters thing. That is a disgrace which also needs to be exposed.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I acknowledge his long-standing campaigning on behalf of the Horizon Postmasters, which is to be welcomed. I was shocked and surprised when I saw the revelations as I took over, and indeed continue to see the stories. The terms of reference of this review is the same as a public inquiry. It's to work out who is to blame. Can it happen again? How can we prevent it from happening again? What the wrongs were, and let's get those righted. The fact is that the chairman will be independent of both the Post Office and government. In terms of the government's roles as the shareholder, clearly the Post Office has operational independence, but there's been numerous attempts over the years to try and resolve the dispute, including an independent investigation in 2013 and a mediation scheme in 2015, which is supported by Post Office Limited and ministers. All of those did fail to resolve the issues, but left the court as the only way of providing the independent view that all sides needed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure we can all agree that sub-postmasters are at the heart of our communities, and no much more so than in the communities I represent in Wednesbury, Oldbury and Tipton. And it is right, Mr. Speaker, that the Post Office can compete during challenging times. But can I ask my right honourable friend to reassure the sub-postmasters in my constituency that the government is going to continue to review the relationship the Post Office has with the sub-postmasters and make sure that they're given the protection and the respect that they are entitled to and deserve?
Grateful to my honourable friend for that. And indeed, one of the first things I said when I spoke to the Chief Exec was acknowledge the fact that we do need to, in order to build the relationship with postmasters of the future and give them the support they need, we need to make sure that we can right the wrongs of the past. But indeed, the Chief Exec has assured me, and his background would suggest that actually he's used to working with sub-postmasters and as stakeholders, and I think that's key, what they need to be.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Postmasters across the country have been fired, gone bankrupt and in some cases gone to prison. Given the scale of this injustice, with over 550 postmasters' families left in financial ruin, does the Minister agree that the current compensation, which fails to cover their legal costs, is neither fair nor just?
Yes. Agree that the fact is that so many people have suffered. Indeed, some people have taken their lives, and as well as losing their livelihoods, and that's not to be forgotten. In terms of the settlement, there was a settlement that I was pleased that was reached by both sides of this agreement. And as I say, sub-postmasters that have been caught within shortfalls of the past that were not in that are able to claim to the historic shortfall scheme.
May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the great frustrations to date has been the refusal of the former senior management of the Post Office to answer detailed questions on this issue and to be held to account. And this is the least that is owed to those who have been wrongly convicted, including my constituent, Siobhan Sayer. Will my right honourable friend confirm that individual culpability of senior management figures within the Post Office will be part of this review?
Yeah, absolutely right.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I totally empathise with the suffering that Siobhan Sayer, his constituent. The independent chairman, who is independent of the Post Office and the government in this, needs to look at exactly what went wrong. When looking at what went wrong, that will by necessity need to look at who took what decisions and when, individuals. It's going to be complicated because this is something that happened over 20 years, a period of 20 years, but nonetheless, they must get to the bottom of it.
Heading to north of the border with Marion Fellows. Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday. Post Office Limited has been allowed to destabilise the Post Office network by its underhand and legally dubious actions. This government must take up its responsibilities as a special shareholder in Post Office Limited and commission a judge-led inquiry. I make no apology for repeating that. Nothing less will do. Will this government help compensate those postmasters who have been obviously so wrongly convicted and help shore up the finances of Post Office Limited moving forward?
In terms of the finances, the government continues to work with the Post Office to work with its needs, to work with making sure that although it's an independent company, that it can actually work within its service obligations. In terms of the review, we recognise the hugely negative impact that the Horizon dispute had on the postmasters. But the financial settlement was a major step towards resolving some of those grievances. But there is more to be done. That's why we've launched the independent review, to ensure the lessons are learned and that they can never be repeated.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
This is one of the worst disasters in public life since the contaminated blood scandal. Does the Minister agree that if it's proven that Post Office executives were aware of the software faults but allowed innocent people to rot in jail, then they were guilty of criminal negligence and possibly criminal conspiracy, and therefore ought to be brought to justice. And will the proposed inquiry allow that to be done?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the question. The IT system, Horizon, was put in place in 1999, with the first issues being raised in the early 2000s. And so that's over a long period of time. But Mr Justice Fraser considered what happened over that and set out his finding in considerable detail. And as I said, he has recommended some individuals to the Criminal Prosecution Service as well, referred them. And so moving forward, Post Office are now working to implement all the vital changes that it's committed to under the leadership of its new CEO to reset the relationships with its postmasters are put in train.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Many hundreds of postmasters were forced to pay back many thousands of pounds to the Post Office. Monies which were never, in fact, owed or indeed missing. That in itself, Mr Speaker, should trigger a criminal investigation. How much of that money went to pay the previous chief executive's £5 million salary? And tell me, Minister, why can you not accept that only a judge will get to the bottom of this miscarriage of justice?
I acknowledge the honourable gentleman's part not only in campaigning since being in this place for the plight of the postmasters, but his previous work as representing some of them in that court case. As I said, the important thing within this review is, does it find out what went wrong? Who made what decisions when? Does it make sure that it can't put anything, that it listens to the evidence of those that were wronged, get those voices out there to complement what Justice Fraser has said and to make sure that it can never happen again? That's the terms of an inquiry, that's the terms of a review. This independent chair will get to the bottom of that whilst being independent of government and the Post Office.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can't understand why the government want to prolong the agony on this by the halfway house of an independent review, and I had my calls for a judge-led review and one that progresses speedily. Does the Minister share my amazement that the Post Office, who have employed these postmasters and postmistresses for years and years and realised that they were decent, hard-working people, suddenly they didn't all become criminals? Did no one ask the questions? Mr Speaker, can we please get on with this and get the full judge-led inquiry now?
Yes. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that, and it's for that very reason that we've announced an independent review. A judge-led inquiry over the last 20 years, the shortest lasted 45 days. That was one minister dealing with two people. This is an incredibly complicated case. The longest inquiry is 13 years in the last 20 years. It cost £600 million in inquiries over the last 20 years. 30 years, forgive me. That is why we need something that will be reasonable in its timing, extensive in its remit, to make sure that we do get to the bottom of this at the appropriate time as quickly as possible.
We're now heading to Bedfordshire with Mohammed Yassin. Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The COVID crisis has revealed what should have been obvious, that key workers, including postmasters, are essential workers and should have been treated with respect, not suspicion. Can the Minister tell me why his department failed to protect workers from a corporate governance failure of this magnitude, and how they will prevent such failure happening again?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for that, and indeed government has challenged over the years, especially in recent years, as the Horizon situation came about over the 20 years. But in recently, as I said, in independent reviews in 2013, investigations in 2015, it has been because it's not been able to get a result that we've had to resort to the courts. But we do need to get to the bottom of this so that not only can we get right the wrongs of the postmasters of the past, but we can get the respect and of the future postmasters to know that they are secure within their positive relationship with the Post Office.
Kevin Holding-Ray.
Mr Speaker, I fear the cover-up could continue. The Post Office have decided to bring in Herbert Smith Freehills to oversee historic cases. This is a practice that contributed to the cover-up of a fraud at Lloyds HBOS for 7 years. Also oversaw the establishment and the operation of the Lloyds Bank Customer Review, which is described by the FCA review of that scheme as discriminatory, as flawed, of an unacceptable denial of responsibility, and that's reviews having to be done over again. Do you think the Post Office should reconsider that decision?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that, and indeed we spoke about this earlier. The Post Office does, as you rightly say, decide on its own legal advisers. The Post Office, as far as I understand it, decided to change its advisers to Herbert Smith Freehills in the latter stages of the litigation, which resulted in the settlement and the good progress on resolving outstanding claimant issues and the successful launch of the historical shortfall scheme.
Going to Scotland with Alan Smith. Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday from me also. We've seen some movement today from the government, and I do welcome that as far as it goes. But like the Equitable Life scandal, which is an ongoing deep injustice, like the people suffering under the loan charge presently, there is a consensus across the House that this just doesn't go far enough. Could I urge the Minister to build on the progress he's announced today, but accept the will of the House that we do need to see a judge-led inquiry into this to properly ventilate all the issues?
Minister. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. As I said, I believe that the terms of reference of this review are deep enough to get to the bottom of exactly what has happened. The fact that the chairman is an independent, who will be appointed, is independent of government, is independent of the Post Office Limited, and will have the freedom to be able to go and find that evidence to complement the evidence that's already been published by Justice Fraser in his judgment. So there will be plenty to draw upon to actually come to the conclusions and recommendations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister not accept that this is as big a scandal, it ranks as big a scandal as the Guildford Four? And although the settlement was reached by mediation, which I approve of, much of that settlement was taken away in cash for lawyers. Can we not do something to make sure that the settlement justifies the indignities that many of these people have had to suffer?
In terms of the scale of the issue, I agree with my honourable friend how this has gone on for so long and taken on so many people who have suffered as a result, some with their lives, as we've heard. But the point is, the mediated settlement between the Post Office was between the Post Office and those sub-postmasters who took out that group litigation. I'm pleased that it came to a conclusion. But as a result of that, the government cannot enter into a new discussion with the Post Office on that basis.
Alistair Carmichael.
It's noble of the Minister to offer himself up as a human shield for Post Office in this way. But I hope that when he returns to the department today, he will tell his officials, who I fear have not maybe briefed him as well as they might have done, and tell also Post Office senior management that this review just isn't going to cut it. Yeah. The Minister says that this is a complex case spanning a long period of time, and he's absolutely right about that. That is why it requires a judge-led inquiry. And that's what will happen eventually. So why not just cut to the quick and do it now?
I keep hearing this. I keep hearing judge-led inquiry, and then I keep hearing that we need to move this on as quickly as possible. The point is that the terms of review reference within this review are the same as a judge-led inquiry. Because what I do not want is an inquiry that's going to last 13 years for sub-postmasters. If the sub-postmasters are going to come back and time again with no justice. This is something that I've been pushing on from the moment that I found out about it, or the detail about it, as Postal Affairs Minister. And this is why I'm going to drive this through to make sure that the answers are heard, that independent chairman, independent of government, independent of Post Office, gets to the bottom of this and gets some answers.
Richard Greb.
Mr. Speaker, in 2015, the Post Offices Limited closed their own review of Horizon IT by saying that there were, quote, no system-wide problems with our computer systems, unquote. Nothing could have been further from the truth. We have all been let down, and many sub-postmasters have been badly treated. Can I urge the Minister to start the independent review as soon as possible to discover precisely who knew what when in Fujitsu, Post Offices Limited and the Federation of Sub-Postmasters? And does he agree with me that nothing should be ruled out, including criminal prosecution if justified?
I totally agree with my honourable friend, and indeed the criminal proceedings continue. The review into the those wrongly convicted continue as well, and this will sit along with Justice Fraser's findings. I do want to move this on as quickly as possible, not to rush anything, but just to make sure that those postmasters can get those answers and bring the injustice to an end.
Heading up to Manchester with Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, and I add my support for a proper judge-led inquiry too. Della Robinson was sub-postmaster at Dukinfield Post Office. She lost her business, the building the post office was in, her rental property, her job and almost her home. Just wrong. So can the Minister confirm that the government is re-evaluating any public positions held by current or former senior employees at the post office who are intimately involved in decisions which victimise sub-postmasters?
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman for that question, and I'm aware that a former chief exec of the post office took up a role as executive director at the Cabinet Office until she stood down. I'm also aware that that the Care Quality Commission has written to Imperial following a fit and proper persons referral, and the CQC is considering this. Lord Callanan has written to the DHSC on the 18th of May to draw the department's attention to the strength of feeling around the former chief exec of the post office position within the NHS.
Andrew Jones.
Yeah. Post offices are at the heart of our communities, yet the postmasters, postmistresses have been so badly let down. I share the anger clearly across the House on this issue. But to keep the network open and viable, it must be attractive to take on a post office franchise. To do that, I think it is a critical question of rebuilding trust. So as he holds the post office to account, will he hold them to account on how they are rebuilding trust with all of the sub-postmasters and postmistresses right across the network?
I thank my honourable friend for that, and I absolutely agree with him. And that's why my conversations, some of my first conversations with Nick Reed, the current chief exec of the post office, is to make sure that he can ensure exactly that. We need to draw the line and right the wrongs of the past to give the respect and trust for future postmasters, but also the support for them as well. Make sure they are valued stakeholders.
Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many innocent sub-postmasters and mistresses have been bankrupted and imprisoned due to the Post Office's heavy-handed approach and wrongly accused of theft when accountancy issues with Horizon reported financial irregularities. And sadly, one of my constituents tragically took his own life after being falsely accused of financial impropriety, leaving his family destitute and without their business. It's too late for an apology or compensation for this family. So, Mr. Minister, what new procedures have the Post Office introduced to protect postmasters and mistresses as a consequence of this scandal? And what protections has the Post Office put in place to ensure accountancy software is fit for purpose? And what action will be taken against those in positions of leadership in the Post Office during this scandal? And would the Minister agree with me that actions speak much louder than words?
I sympathise with the honourable lady's constituent who sadly took her life, and that's one of many tragic stories. And indeed, this is exactly what the fact is that we've now got the Post Office to accept its wrong position. The fact that the Horizon software could make mistakes, that things were being changed there, and that is why it's important to get that acknowledgement. But it's also important that we continue to build trust with sub-postmasters of the relationship with the Post Office, and that's what I make sure that every time I speak to the Chief Exec, that is top of our agenda.
Steve Baker.
Mr. Speaker, if the government accepts that software can never be thought infallible, will the Minister take steps to ensure that the law and policy making reflects the truth that all software has bugs?
I thank my honourable friend, and will of course review that and keep that in our mind.
Manjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday.
The Post Office Horizon scandal begs the question, why didn't the Post Office believe its own postmasters, many sub-postmasters, many of whom had given decades of loyal service, even after evidence was presented to them that the Horizon system was most likely faulty? And can the Secretary of State give a cast-iron guarantee, as other honourable and right honourable members have requested, to all those sub-postmasters and their families whose lives have been ruined, that there will be a judge-led inquiry, not merely a review, so that we can ascertain how this happened, who is responsible, and what steps can be taken to ensure that this never happens again?
I thank my honourable gentleman for that promotion, the Secretary of State, but look, he raises some really important points. And the point is, whether you call it a review or inquiry, the terms of reference are exactly as he describes. We do want to make sure that we can get to the bottom of this, find out who made what decisions, how they were made, and that they can never happen again. That's exactly why I've pushed to make this happen as soon as possible.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isabel Wall was a sub-postmistress in Barrow. She ran a thriving shop, let flats above the property, but as a result of the scandal, she lost everything. She was the very first person to come and see me at a surgery as a newly elected MP, and I carry the anger that she brought to that meeting with me. Does my right honourable friend accept that whilst the Post Office has accepted it's got things wrong, there is a long, long way to go for people like Miss Wall before they're properly compensated for the financial and the emotional losses they faced? Will he confirm that the government will give weight to fair compensation being paid to wronged sub-postmasters and mistresses?
Isabel Wall is just one of a number of far too many constituents of ours who have suffered from this, and the honourable gentleman opposite was right when he talked about the fact that the Post Office should have had more faith and trust in its post office masters. And of course we will make sure that we can get to the bottom of this to get some justice for Isabel Wall. In terms of the group litigation, as I said, I'm glad that they've reached a review. Sub-postmasters who a settlement. In terms of sub-postmasters who have not yet been part of a case but may have suffered a shortfall, I do encourage them to come forward to take advantage of the historic shortfall scheme which the Post Office launched.
Heading to Scotland with Neil Gray. Neil Gray.
Many happy returns, Mr. Speaker. There is no doubt that there have been many grave injustices served upon sub-postmasters and mistresses, some of whom have gone to jail and lost everything. I know my constituents in Airdrie and Shotts will want two things. First, to see justice done and the full facts brought out in a public inquiry, which is why a judge-led public inquiry is so important. But they will also want to see their local post office network protected and ensure the network is shielded from the potential ramifications of the actions of management. So what plan does the Minister have to ensure both?
In terms of the inquiry, I've set out the fact that the terms of reference are wide and deep enough. In terms of a judge, the judge has already reviewed this situation. Justice Fraser has already come up with many pages of response about what happened when and what went wrong. We need to make sure that we can build on that evidence, listen very, very carefully to those who have been wronged, and make sure it can never happen again.
Heading to Bob Blackman in Harrow. Bob Blackman.
Happy birthday, Mr. Speaker. We are all aware that victims of this scandal have lost their livelihoods, their savings, their reputations, and some their liberty as a result of a faulty computer system. I know my honourable friend understands the financial and emotional suffering that the Horizon litigation has brought upon the victims. Does my honourable friend agree that actually the only right and just situation will be to restore those victims to exactly the financial position they would have been in had this faulty system not occurred? Full compensation, an apology, and equally the real criminals brought to justice.
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and the point he raises, as I say, is that this is why it took a court to get to the bottom of this, to actually break the deadlock that was happening over so many years, which should have been settled so much earlier. And that's why in December 29, both parties in the group litigation agreed a settlement following several days of mediation, which is a financial settlement totalling £57.75 million. Convicted claimants can still go through a further process as well, where there are processes in place for them to receive compensation if appropriate.
Returning to Scotland with Deb Dugan. Deb Dugan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Post Office was not slow in dragging hard-working, honest sub-postmasters and mistresses before the courts based on spurious data from a flawed IT system, and one which they knew to be flawed, thereby depriving good people at the centre of their communities of their reputations, their businesses, their personal assets, in some instances their liberty, and tragically for some their lives. Does the Minister accept that a judge-led public inquiry, not a review, is required now without delay, and that anything less is a further assault on the welfare of Horizon victims?
Minister.
The finding is outlined during the Horizon case, provided extensive insight already as to what went wrong with the Post Office, including the independent judicial review of the facts that all sides have been looking for. But because of the serious impacts of this case, that's why more needs to be done. We want to be assured that the right lessons are learned, and that's the purpose of the independent review that we're in the process of setting up.
Morrissey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister join me in paying tribute to the postmasters in Beaconsfield and Bucks and across the country who have tirelessly carried on throughout COVID-19? And will you join me in paying tribute to Mr. Patel, who passed away from COVID-19 and served the people of Hedgeley loyally, lovingly known as CD to many of the customers? And as we think of justice, will you please not only demand an apology, but demand justice for the countless men and women who served and have suffered at the hands of the Post Office, and they see no justice, and I hope that you will have the courage to deliver that for them.
I thank my honourable friend, and justice is exactly what I want to be seen to be done. And I would go further to extend my sympathies to the family of Mr. Patel as well, because we mustn't forget in all of this, at this particular moment in time, postmasters up and down in the country are doing an incredible job for the most vulnerable people in society.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and a happy birthday. At Prime Minister's questions on the 24th of February, the Prime Minister agreed with me to commit to holding an independent inquiry into this horrific scandal. I followed this question up with a letter to the Prime Minister. 3 months later, I received a response from the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite just this week. I welcome the Government's commitment into a review of mishandlings, but this cannot just be a review into past mistakes. With a background of many years in the postal industry, I know many whose lives have been destroyed by this scandal, including sub-postmasters and mistresses in my constituency of Jarrow. So I ask him again, and I make absolutely no apology for doing so. Will the Minister commit to having a judge-led review as quickly as possible that will take action against those responsible for the scandal and ensure that each individual case is assessed and proper compensation is paid to all of those affected?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for the work that she's done on this matter, and given her background as well, I can understand her motivation. But it's important to know, as I say, this independent review is wide enough and deep enough in terms of its terms of reference to get to the bottom of what happened. An independent judge has already looked at the evidence and built up that body of evidence, their views, which will then be looked in complement to this. Don't forget, public inquiries can't determine criminal or civil guilt in themselves. That's reserved for a court.
Mahendra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Happy birthday. As many colleagues have alluded to in the House today, we've seen the importance of postal submasters during this global pandemic. What reassurance can my honourable friend give that the Post Office Limited has understood that there needs to be fundamental cultural and organisational change to ensure that postmasters and sub-postmasters come forward to ensure that critical network of post offices remains in our communities for years to come?
Minister.
Thank you, honourable friend. And I think that lesson has definitely been learnt by the new chief executive, and certainly is in terms of the government. The government has worked as the shareholders, working with a new framework with the Post Office to make sure that we can build a solid, confident relationship with future sub-postmasters. Nick Reed's background working with independent convenience stores, I think, demonstrates the fact, or suggests the fact, that he's used to working with people as stakeholders rather than as simple employees or instruments of a large company.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday. The Minister has said several times at the dispatch box that the victims of this situation need to be heard and their cases listened to. So, can the Minister name any one of them that is in agreement with his position and is not calling for an independent judge-led inquiry?
Minister.
I think if the sub-postmasters that have been wronged by this want some justice, and they want it quickly. What I don't want to happen is a public inquiry that may take many years, cost a lot of money for them to get more legal representation in. When they've had the chance to study this terms of reference, they realise that the chair will be independent of government. It will be independent of the Post Office. He will actually, or her, will actually listen to those people to make sure their stories are told, not just to listen to them, but make sure those stories are actually there to feed into making sure this can never happen again. Then I hope they will see that justice can be done.
Yeah. I think we learned from my honourable friend the Minister's response to my honourable friend for Cleethorpes that one of the stumbling blocks to a judge-led inquiry is cost. Does he agree with me that it is absolutely imperative that the honest, decent sub-postmasters and mistresses of the whole of the country, and indeed specifically in Romsey and Southampton North, should not have a price put on lifting the stain on their characters?
Yeah. I thank the honourable lady for that, honourable friend for that question. Members that have been wronged, sub-postmasters that have been wronged, including in Romsey, need to make sure that their voices can be heard in a good time, quickly as well, with no cost, and actually make sure that this can never happen again, and they can have acknowledgement that there have been severe mistakes that have caused misery for so many.
Back to Scotland with Martin Day. Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This scandal represents a massive failure of accountability and oversight, not just by Post Office Limited, but also by government. So will the Minister apologise to those whose lives have been ruined? And what assurances can he give that the losses arising from the Horizon case doesn't affect postmasters' pay and therefore unfairly penalise even more postmasters and sub-postmasters?
Thank the honourable gentleman. There's been numerous attempts, as I say, over the years to try and resolve the dispute. The fact is that the Post Office has independent operational control. But in hindsight, facts have come through the litigation, which has revealed that advice that the government has received and the shareholders received over that period was flawed. So that's why government's going to be monitoring closely the progress of Post Office in delivering the programme of commitments following that settlement, including through the review. We've also reviewed our mechanisms in place to maintain oversight of the Post Office by increasing the frequency of shareholder meetings, establishing a Post Office policy team within BEIS and publishing a framework document to govern the relationship between BEIS, UKGI and the Post Office.
Staying in Scotland with Amy Callaghan. Amy Callaghan.
A very happy birthday to you, Mr. Speaker. This government have had 6 months to enact an inquiry, 6 months to seek justice for the damage, disruption and loss of livelihood caused by this scandal, not just to see if the Post Office has learned lessons. The Secretary of State has said he pushed for this independent review, but what about listening to the sub-postmasters who have been left destitute by this scandal and provide them with the judge-led inquiry they so desperately want? So will the Secretary of State stop stalling with reviews and commit to this judge-led inquiry today?
We can talk about semantics. What I think we need is actually terms of reference that actually gets people what they want. And a review, whether you call it a review, whether you call it a inquiry, the fact is that this does understand and acknowledge what went wrong in relation to Horizon by drawing on the evidence. It will assess whether the Post Office has learnt its lessons. It will assess whether the commitments made by the Post Office within the mediation settlement have been properly delivered, and assess whether the processes and information provided by Post Offices to postmasters are sufficient to make sure, and also examine the governance and whistleblowing controls now in place at Post Office Limited. These are the answers that we need to make sure that we can get in a timely fashion as possible. I'm sorry it's taken 6 months. If it'd been, these things are complicated, and I'd love to have announced it that following day. But I'm glad now we have terms of reference which I believe are deep enough and wide enough to get the answers we need and sub-postmasters desperately been waiting for.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend, the Minister, is quite right to emphasise the need for speed. But, Mr. Speaker, people have taken their own lives. They've been wrongly convicted and imprisoned. It doesn't get much more serious than that. And this House is here to defend the liberties of our constituents. Will he also bear in mind that the Prime Minister confirmed on the 26th of February that there would indeed be an inquiry? And following this urgent question today, will he discuss with his colleagues in government whether the will of the House may be different on this point from the will of the government?
Indeed, we've looked at the different options, and what I do not want, as I say, is something that is long drawn out and costly for sub-postmasters, which doesn't necessarily get the answers for years and years and years to come, if ever. Someone used to say to me, there's a phrase, less haste, more speed. So, yes, we need to make sure that we can do this in a timely fashion, but that doesn't mean we need to rush through the detail as the review is going ahead. We need to listen to the views of the sub-postmasters that have been wronged. We need to put that alongside the findings of Justice Fraser to make sure that this will never happen again.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday to you too. Government speak as if there's nothing they could have done as a special shareholder. Well, of course there could. It's left communities in York like Clifton now bereft of a post office. The fact is the government sat on its hands, didn't use its powers, as submasters and submistresses were thrown into jail, made bankrupt, and for some they took their lives. Does the government not want a full judge-led inquiry with the powers necessary to investigate and dig deep? Because a review itself does not hold those powers, because it will expose their failings in this matter.
The Post Office has said that it will comply fully with this. I will push fully for that compliance as well, and I'm sure the independent chair will want to get right to the bottom of this, however long it takes. But we do need to get on with it and get it started now. In terms of the government's actions over the past few years, as I say, this is something that's happened over 20 years. With hindsight, facts have come to light, as I say, that over the litigation that some advice has received that's been flawed. But we have pushed to make sure that we can get a settlement for many, many years, and I'm glad that we're at the point that we can start to get some answers.
Sarah Dines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a barrister of over 30 years' experience, I have to say I've witnessed at first hand the sheer devastation that a wrong conviction or even an accusation that is false brings upon a family. This is the United Kingdom. This is an injustice. Can I be assured by the Minister that following the review, there are very real sanctions that follow on, because this has effectively destroyed a much-loved public institution?
I thank the honourable friend for that question, and she's right when she talks about the much-loved institution, because what we mustn't lose within this, that the Post Office is doing amazing work, sub-postmasters are doing amazing work up and down this country, and we mustn't make sure that their reputation is tarnished with the actions of what's happened over a 20-year period. We do need to have those answers as quickly as we can, so that I can see and government can see and we can all see what those recommendations are that the chairman will come forward from that review.
We now come to Dr. Rupa.
Many happy returns from me too, Mr. Speaker. For the Patels, moving from being managers of Acton Crown Post Office for over 3 decades to their own sub-postmaster role in the country was meant to be a dream come true. But it turned into a nightmare when they lost not only substantial sums, but their mental and physical health, their reputations. He ended up with a criminal electronic tag on, the humiliation of it. So they want to know, why in Acton, for over 20 years, were they seen as upstanding pillars of the community? You know, they handled multi-million sums in a safe key. Then suddenly in Oxfordshire, they were falsely branded as criminals. Why did it take the Criminal Review Case Commission to say that this is now a miscarriage of justice? Where was the oversight? And finally, Can you make good on the promise Paula Venables gave to me in 2018 that Acton Post Office will be reopened? It closed on her watch, and she's done a runner since then.
In terms of closures, post offices that have got the most stable network that we've had for a number of years now. So that's something, obviously, with COVID-19 notwithstanding, we need to make sure we can build on. But I want to find those answers as well about why the 3 Patels that she described to her constituents, who were fine, upstanding members of the community, were seen as that because of the actions of the post office. That's why we need to get this review done. That's why we need to get the recommendations out by the independent chairman as well, so that we can see justice done.
42 withdrawn. Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and many happy returns of the day. Mr. Speaker, the scale of this scandal demands no less than a judge-led inquiry that has appropriate power. So why can't the Minister accept that this is the only way to fully examine, get answers, and into how this sorry saga went on for so long and caused so much misery and heartache to constituents of mine and thousands more across the country?
Minister.
Thank the honourable gentleman. We have 1,000 pages of findings by Justice Fraser to build on. We have the criminal convictions that are going through, the reviews, that are going through to overturn and look at a number of convictions. We have this review to build on all of that, and then all of that body of work will, I hope and believe, will find the answers that sub-postmasters are after about when decisions were taken, who took those decisions, how they went wrong, how they were allowed to go wrong, and the fact is that we get some answers so it can never happen again.
Speaker, I think the Minister is doing an excellent job, and I have been in his position where I have announced a review but I wasn't allowed to call it a review. So I appreciate that he might think that it's just semantics, the difference between a review and an inquiry, but for many people those semantics really matter. And so I share colleagues' views about the need for an independent inquiry. But I would also like to know what the Minister is going to do about the financial compensation, because I appreciate that he has said that there's limits on what government can do. But I do think it's really important that he does look again at this issue and he sees what steps can be taken to ensure that those affected are fully and fairly compensated.
Minister.
Well, in terms of compensation, as I say, the mediation that took place allowed a settlement to be reached by the members of that group litigation, and other members, other sub-postmasters who have been found to be wrongly convicted will have other procedures that they can go through to get the compensation. And indeed, any postmasters that feel that they weren't part of that litigation but suffered a shortfall as a result of the Post Office will be able to apply to the historic scheme. The point is, though, about the inquiry and the review is that I believe this review will be able to get to the answers, will be able to build on the body of evidence that Justice Fraser has built up throughout his findings through his court case as well. So there will be a lot of answers there for recommendations to come forward to secure the future of the trust and relationship with postmasters at the Post Office.
Going back to Scotland with Douglas Chapman. Douglas Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and a happy birthday to you too. Following this case being taken to the High Court, I have read that some Fujitsu employees are being investigated for perjury, which I think is a big deal. What discussions has the Minister had with the Attorney-General and the Department of Justice on this issue, and when will he announce a judge-led inquiry into this whole sorry debacle?
My understanding is that Justice Fraser has referred a number of people to the Criminal Prosecution Service.
We now come to Derek Thomas.
I hope that all the time taken to wish her happy birthday has not delayed any celebration you might have planned for later. So I want to raise a case which is one of many. Susan Knight was a postmistress of 32 years who was dragged before magistrates' courts 3 times, Truro Crown Court twice, made to pay £20,000, over £20,000. This lady's life was made a misery, her reputation trashed, and 32 years of service to the Post Office counting for nothing. It's too late for her to rebuild her business. She is basically left with nothing. Having heard what the Minister has said today, can he assure me and my constituents and Susan Knight that she will be adequately compensated in good time without a huge effort to try and achieve this result?
Minister.
I thank the honourable friend for that comment. And the Susan Knight, and indeed he was telling me about another constituent of his who was a landlady of a local pub who lost that pub, and it was another story, a terrible story that we've heard alongside members from all sides of the House about their constituents. In terms of the compensation, members of the group litigation scheme joined in that settlement. I'm pleased that the settlement was reached after many, many years and deadlock was broken. But as I said, if anybody else that hasn't claimed can join the historic shortfall scheme, and if the people who've been wrongly convicted, there will be procedures in place for them to actually claim compensation via that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday. So while the Post Office were wilfully hiding their own failings, they operated a system that the sub-postmasters were automatically guilty. The Post Office then ran their own prosecutions, so in effect they were judge, jury and executioner. So this proves that we need a judge-led public inquiry with all the powers associated with that can get full disclosure and call for evidence. But in the meantime, can you tell me what steps the government have taken to ensure that this abuse of power can never be replicated and that sub-postmasters now have contracts that are fair and transparent?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, and Justice Fraser is that independent judge that has looked into exactly those positions that he described, and that's why we want to build on those findings in terms of what happens next. The Post Office has realised and finally come up to acknowledged that it is done wrong. And the fact is that we do need to make sure within our new relationship, our new framework as government, as the sole shareholder of the Post Office, that we can analyse the work that is done to earn the trust and rebuild that relationship with future sub-postmasters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The biggest disgrace about all of this is where innocent people have been incarcerated and imprisoned. Could I ask the Minister to confirm if there are any sub-postmasters or mistresses who are currently in prison, and if that is the case, will he commit to expedite immediately a full investigation into their specific cases for their release, if that is appropriate?
What we're not going to do in terms of the review is to get into the way in the way of the Criminal Case Review Commission. It's really important that they do actually go through that process as quickly as possible, not just for any number of reasons, not least to lift the conviction of people wrongly convicted. But he's absolutely right to decry the fact that people have been put in prison wrongly. And their reputation suffered, their lives suffered, and indeed, in certain cases, their lives ended. That's why I want to make sure that we can get on and set this review up and find those answers to move forward.
Mr. Speaker, if the review that he proposes is just as deep and wide-ranging and going into the complexities than a judge-led inquiry, the question is why it should be less time-consuming and more cost-effective than a judge-led inquiry. I understand the government always says no before it says yes, so for a last time today, will he commit to a judge-led inquiry?
I can give you one easy answer why it takes so long, and that's lawyers. If you have a public inquiry, you tend to get a lot of expense that both sides lawyering up, to use the vernacular. That's why the 600 million quid being spent in the last 30 years on public inquiries. Now, we can either spend a lot of time and a lot of working on that, or we can get through a review, build on the independent judge that has already looked at this case, that has already built up the foundations, and making sure that we can add to that by listening to the voices of those people that have gone through absolute hell.
Penultimate question, Colm McCann.
Hearty birthday felicitations, Speaker. Throughout the financial and emotional suffering the Horizon process has caused postmasters and their families across the country, I have been kept informed of developments by the Belgate Post Office submaster Simon Clark in my constituency of Lincoln. Can my honourable friend tell me, and the House, how many senior managers responsible for the position the Post Office have taken have resigned or been sanctioned or had any bonus payments revoked?
I think one of the problems with this, I thank the honourable friend, because one of the problems with this case is that it's happened over 20 years. And so actually this has meant that a lot of people moved on, that have gone round, and it's been difficult to follow the people that have gone through the system at all this point in time. This is why, though, I hear from the sedentary position, giving the former chief exec the CBE. This is why we followed that up. That she went through the Independent Honours Commission, who worked on that in a separate process. But we actually have made sure that we've written to ask if she's a fit and proper person in terms of the CQC and the positions that we've had that she now holds.
Final question, Lucia.
Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate you including me on the call list. I sympathise with my right honourable friend, and I know that he will have heard what has been said today and will be listening very carefully. A succession of his predecessors have come to that dispatch box over years to read out statements from officials we know had closely connected relationships with Post Office management and who knew that an injustice had occurred. What will he do to tackle the network of intertwined vested interests that are on his doorstep, and I include the Cabinet Office and ex-Fujitsu employees, which led to this shameful and tragic scandal and cover-up?
What we're making sure we do is that maybe many government ministers come in here. It's this government minister that's actually pushed to make sure that we can have a review, that we can have an independently chaired review, separate from the Post Office, separate from government, to come up with those answers. That's what postmasters want. We've made sure in government that we've come up with a new framework for an increased frequency of shareholder meetings as well, to make sure that we can hold Post Office to account for its actions, but also make sure that the taxpayer gets the most out of the Post Office, that the communities get the most of the out of the Post Office, but importantly, that postmasters can feel confident that they can build up a trustful relationship as valued stakeholders within that Post Office network.
In order to allow the safe